Okay, can everybody hear me? I can hear me, so that's a good sign. Welcome back to our further adventures with robots today. What we're going to do today, and I kind of highlighted this yesterday a little bit, is that now that we have in our hands, quite literally as a matter of fact, the holdings in the synthesized rule from yesterday. Did everybody get one of these handouts? Basically, there's a few over here. Basically, what I try to do is capture the... hi, guys. Look, I'm all the way up here in the audience. I feel like I'm doing crowd work now. Hi, how's it going? Where are you from? You guys here from out of town? Or you enjoying the show? I should do more. Okay, I'm just going to hand that to you and let you pass them around this way. They'll come down this direction. Can you pass those down that way? Speaking of crowd work, I think Ray is going to help me today and maybe mic you guys up a little bit. This will be just like a full-blown talk show scenario. But what we have as a result of our discussion yesterday and our work in listening to those podcast episodes and kind of slowing them down a little bit and teasing out the conceptual stuff that was hidden inside of there, sort of pulling those concepts out and piecing them together. What we have now to use for today's effort is what you have there in your hand. And if you look at it, it's a combination of two things. We have our synthesized rule here at the top, and then, four holdings underneath that, each one from the episodes that we took a listen to yesterday. That's sort of what I would describe as the bottom-up work that you do in law school, right? And it's going to mirror, to some extent, what you do on kind of a day-to-day basis in most of your doctrinal classes. You'll have an issue you guys are going to be dealing with. You can read some cases associated with that issue. And hopefully, at the end of that discussion, at the end of that week or 2 week period that you spend talking about an issue, you'll be in a position where you can do something kind of similar to this, right? You can have a combination of all of your holdings from the cases, and hopefully from that be able to synthesize sort of a generalized rule that would govern all four of those cases, and like I mentioned yesterday, potentially a new one, right? Which is the goal today. That once that process is over, when the exam comes or when the midterm comes, what you'll be handed is a new hypothetical situation, and you'll be asked to take the work that you've done. This is going to be fun, I can tell already, right? The work that you've done over the course of the semester, the issues that you've kind of worked with and analyzed over the course of the semester, take that work, use it now in a deductive fashion, from the top down, basically, and apply it to that new hypothetical to resolve an unresolved issue. And then once that issue is resolved, it just sort of joins the team, right? It becomes the new case that sort of falls in line with the ones that you've talked about previously. And maybe, who knows, in some weird way, depending on the facts of the hypo, maybe it too contributes something to the general rule. Maybe it helps clarify something, or maybe it sort of modifies the rule in some fashion. It's pretty typical for your professors in law school to try to draft hypotheticals that challenge the rule a little bit, right? They don't always want to draft one that's right in the pocket. It's pretty obvious, like, oh, is a Roomba? They're not going to give you that, right? They're not going to ask you if a self-driving car is a robot, because it's just a little bit too close to what you've already seen. The goal in crafting a good hypothetical is to take what you've dealt with in class, take a case or take a concept that you've dealt with in class, and modify it just a bit, right? Challenge it a bit, sort of push it to its limits to see if you can argue that despite those differences between a self-driving car and a Roomba, or a Roomba and a flatworm Lego toy, that they still belong under the same rule, right? They still sort of reside under the same rule. And the rule, although the rule may treat each one differently, it's close enough that you've found the correct rule and you've applied that rule to the set of facts to reach a conclusion. In doing that, you kind of do what's referred to as an IRAC, and you guys have probably heard this a few times already. It's sort of just a model for presenting, also analyzing too, but a lot of times you're going to deal with it in the context of presenting an analysis to somebody in a top-down fashion, in sort of a deductive fashion. And I'll describe that to you a little bit more in just a minute. Even though, the process of building the rule and discovering the holdings and interpreting the cases is kind of a bottom-up process, and it involves, some analysis and some mental gymnastics that we went through last time. When you present that to somebody, whether that somebody is a law school professor or a judge or even a client under some circumstances, they don't want to do that work too. Okay, they want to present it to them from the top down. They don't want to sit and wonder what the rule is. They don't want you to keep them in suspense with respect to what the rule might be. The way you present it to them is in a very kind of lazy fashion, so that they can have the boring podcast where they already know what the rule is for a robot, and you're just applying it to a set of facts and reaching a conclusion. So you take your rule, and that's fills in the R spot of the IRAC, and the analysis or application, the A, is where a lot of the fun stuff happens, a lot of the new stuff happens, right? Where you'll do a combination of two things. You'll take the facts from your hypothetical in conjunction with not all of the holdings, right? I don't want to use all of the holdings. Just the holdings that seem like they're relevant to the situation. They're the holdings that are close enough to your situation that you can draw an analogy or a distinction that's worthwhile and will help you resolve the issue using the rule and leave no gaps really analytically in that overall process. So you can tell that if you go into an exam and you're asked to do this part, right? You're presented with a hypothetical and you're asked to IRAC it. You want to make sure that you have the tools with you to get the job done. And in my mind, those tools are organized by issue, a series of holdings, a synthesized rule that sort of corresponds with that issue or is linked to that issue, so that you can have those things at the ready and you can simply apply them in an IRAC format and resolve a new hypo, okay? When it's all said and done, to a certain extent, you're already going to, in your outline, you're going to have the issue, you're going to have the rule already. Really, the only thing you're worried about is the A and the C, right? The application, the conclusion. Make sure you do that synthesis process before you get to the exam, right? If you have like 30 minutes to work on a problem, you don't want to be synthesizing the rule in that 30 minutes. You want to have the rule already synthesized outside of class. You slip it over into your IRAC, and you just want to spend that 30 minutes applying the rule to the facts using cases for analogy. Okay? Are there any questions about that before I move on? We're going to practice it a little bit. I'll talk about IRAC in a little bit more detail. So then you guys have this thing at the ready. And when it comes time to outline an issue, outline a particular concept for class, the holdings themselves, if you notice, if you viewed each one of those 4 cases, we'll call them cases versus episodes, there isn't, it's almost like a brief that's been crammed down into something much smaller, right? It's almost like you reduced what was initially a brief of those cases into just the holding for the case, because ultimately it's going to be the holding that you want to use when it comes time to do the IRAC, right? If your professor wants you to IRAC this issue, whether something's a robot or not a robot, they don't want to see the issue, the rule, and then an entire case brief or two, right? That's what they're looking for between the rule and the actual facts, the hypothetical, is maybe just a holding. And we talked last time about the components of a holding, and one of the reasons I like to kind of hook into a holding as having 3 basic components is it helps me sort of reduce the size of it, but make sure that it's complete and useful for me in some way. So for each one of those, what I try to do essentially is give you sort of a procedural result, right? Sort of the self-driving car, not a robot, Roomba, baseline robot, flatworm robot. I didn't really get into Johnny 5, I should say not a robot as well. But what the procedural result is, it's either a robot or not a robot, right? And then on top of that, the facts that are relevant to that decision that was made by the court. And then lastly, any sort of reasoning or rationale by the court. That's the essence, kind of the guts of what you want to have in your outline with respect to those cases. If you have that in conjunction with the synthesized rule, basically what we've done is we just took our work from yesterday, turned it upside down, right? And you have your rule and your holdings there. All you're going to have to do is slide in the hypothetical facts underneath here, choose the case you want to use, right? You can almost go back and say, well, the hypothetical that Hill just gave me isn't close enough to Johnny 5 or the flatworm Lego example. I'm going to cross those out. I'm going to use those two holdings, squeeze his facts in here, reach a conclusion, and that's an IRAC, right? So you guys are just running up and down sort of the analytical ladder, essentially, from the facts to the rule, and from the rule back down to the facts, okay? So we're going to practice that a little bit today. So with that said, you can almost kind of visualize your outlines for class are going to be in an outline format, sort of a traditional outline format with Roman numeral 1, sub-issue A, A1, A2, A3, because issues oftentimes are comprised of large issues, and hidden inside of those large issues can be some smaller issues in the form of elements or factors, things that you have to interpret in that way. But for every issue that you're presented with in class, you're looking to basically include that same package of information, a synthesized rule of some sort, a rule that sort of would help you resolve the issue, and any holdings you think might be useful in that resolution too, okay? And so if you kind of view this in the context of your torts class, in torts you guys are going to be talking about the intentional torts, negligent torts, you'll talk about strict liability. If my outline for my torts class was arranged initially in those three big categories, and then for each one, that first one might be battery, maybe assault, intentional infliction of emotional distress. Negligence has, 4 elements: duty, breach, causation. I'm building out each issue, each sort of turn in the road, making sure that I have a rule and some holdings that correspond with it, okay? And if you're doing that, and you're doing it over the course of the semester, a couple things happen. Like the actual time that you're asked to do it in kind of a formal setting, oftentimes doesn't occur until you're presented with either a midterm or a final, right? And if it's a final, it could be 14 weeks out. You guys are building this stuff along the way, and you don't really get a chance necessarily to test it in the context of an exam until maybe later in the semester. Part of the reason that somebody will use the sort of the Socratic method in class, or sort of a Q&A method in class, is to do a little bit of that testing along the way. See if you can test the limits of the rule that you guys are putting together, test the limits of the cases that you're reading. So to a certain extent, you get to do this process, this IRAC process, in class, in the form of questions and answers. But I would encourage you to try to find opportunities to sort of test them on your own. So in addition to synthesizing rules and outlining for class, you want to sort of present in a weird way yourself with hypotheticals and see if you can apply those rules to the hypotheticals and reach some conclusions. We were talking about that a little bit in class yesterday, and I'm missing the person I was talking to that to. He had mentioned maybe just kind of walking around playing the game, Is That a Robot? Which is, sounds a little crazy, but you're testing the rule, right? There you are, right there. Gives you a chance to test the rule. See, I just called you out in front of everybody, and I'm like, what's this guy do? Gives you a chance to test the rule and test what you're building in conjunction with the rule, okay? Because what's not going to happen is you're not going to complete this process, do all of this hard work, hoping and anticipating that when you get an exam that your torts professor is going to say, okay, what's the synthesized rule for battery, right? Your torts, first question on your exam is not going to be, what's the synthesized rule for duty? Just doesn't work that way. You could spend an entire semester doing this stuff, and if you haven't worked with hypotheticals, you're going to be surprised because it'll look more like this, okay? And I actually pulled this off of a torts exam, kind of an old one. But you'll be confronted with this instead of the question of what is the rule for strict liability. Instead, you're going to have this story about an escaped monkey when Hurricane Andrew hit Florida, and Jill thought the macaque gave it to a neighbor. That night, the monkey took a serious bite out of Bob's arm. So what you're going to end up with is just a story about a crazy monkey, right? And if you haven't kind of steeped yourself in how this process works, that's going to be a little bit shocking, okay? There really isn't, until you reach the kind of the end there, please explain the grounds for liability, assess their validity, and discuss the defenses which are likely to be raised by the defendants in the course of litigation. You'd be saying to yourself, wow, I was in class every day and we didn't talk about monkeys at all, right? Monkeys didn't come up even once during that process. This is how it works. You're just handed a new hypothetical. You're just given a new set of facts to work with, essentially. and to try to resolve in the course of 30 minutes in this case, relying on the rules and the holdings that you've put together for torts. Okay? The first step in that process can be kind of tricky and not really one that we're going to focus on too much right now. You notice that the kind of the call to the question at the end says, please explain the grounds for liability. What he's asking you to do there is spot some issues, right? You have to go back and just look at that set of facts and say, okay, how many legal issues are hiding in here? Part of this process that can be tricky just from an IRAC standpoint is you may not always just be handed the issue. We're going to talk today. When we practice this thing, I'll say, "Is this a robot?" Right? He's left that open for you here. He's going to let you go ahead and see if you can discern how many issues are lurking inside of there. Okay. My sense of it, there's probably a negligence claim in there. There's probably a strict liability claim in there as well. I don't know if there's any sort of intentional torts in there. But the first thing you have to do is determine how many issues are in that hypothetical and how many you can resolve conceivably in 30 minutes. Right? Sometimes that can be a little bit of a clue as to how much of this work you need to do. Issue spotting is a weird concept. It's a difficult thing to explain, and it takes some practice. But your friend in doing this really is that outline once again. Okay? There's two ways in which you'll be able to spot the issues in this hypothetical if you've kind of done the laborious work of putting together your outline and synthesizing your rules. There's a natural sort of sense that these facts fit within one of the categories you've created, one of the rules you've synthesized, right? You look at those facts and say, oh yeah, I recognize that. But if I look at those facts in the in the context of, or with the backdrop of the rule for strict liability, or the rule for negligence, that to me sounds like it would fit in there, right? I could fit those facts into one of those boxes I've created. I could fit those facts into the synthesized rule that I've created. That's when an issue is born, right? That sounds to me like it would fit neatly in the rule I've created for strict liability. Therefore, my issue is strict liability, and now I can just go ahead and get my synthesized rule over there, start applying it to these facts, and reaching a conclusion. The other way you can do this, it'll sound a lot like a case you've already read in class, right? You can say, oh, that sounds like the escaped snake from the zoo case that we read. Let me check my outline. Oh, that case is hanging out in my outline underneath negligence. That's where we read the snake case. If it sounds an awful lot like the snake case, I can just zoom out from that and realize that both of those cases live underneath the negligence rule. That's my issue. I'm going to go ahead and apply it, okay? Issue spotting is easier to do if you're comfortable with the content of your outline. So another good reason why you want to kind of go through this process as laborious as it can be sometimes. Work through this process and put together an outline for use on an exam, okay? So there you go. You'd be handed that thing, you'd be given 30 minutes. And like I said, realistically, if that was 45 minutes, I'd probably be looking for 3 issues. 30 minutes, I'd probably be looking for 2, essentially. Sometimes the timing can give you a sense of how many issues your professor wants you to resolve in the course of any hypothetical. So the first step, spot your issues. Second step, choose which issues you want to talk about in the time related to it, and just IRAC those issues, okay? Sometimes, and this was my biggest problem in law school, I'd end up with like 15 issues, right? Like, well, there's one of those in there too. And you have to kind of go back and say, okay, I can't really do 15 issues in 30 minutes. Let's slow down a little bit and figure out. A lot of times you have to go back and do a little bit of a whittling down process where you say, okay, realistically, these are the 2 obvious issues. This one seems a little bit out there. I'm going to cut that one out and run with these 2. Do a nice, thorough job of presenting them in 30 minutes and score the points I need. Okay. In some instances, I think you'd almost be better off being able to complete 2 complete IRACs and leaving that third issue out of the equation rather than trying to kind of cram in every issue under the sun. Right. Part of this is too. It's interesting because you can start to see what your job is, right? What you're being asked to do here, essentially. You don't want to hand your outline to your professor and say, you go ahead and do this, right? They want you to make these decisions. And when you work in practice, you work at a firm, they also want you to make these decisions. They don't want you to, they don't want to hand you a research project and you sort of hand it back to them. And part of that means making some pretty difficult decisions sometimes. It's hard to say, wow, okay, we just spent 15 weeks in torts talking about all of these various torts, and in the context of this problem, I'm only going to cherry pick 2 of those and work with 2. I'd much rather talk about all of the torts, and then my professor will know that I know all of the torts, right? That's not what you want to do here. You don't want to kitchen sink every tort you've talked about as a way of demonstrating your knowledge. You want to have faith in the idea that this problem requires the use of holdings and rules from just maybe 2 torts, right? And I'm going to let those rest of those torts maybe pop up in a different question, or in some instances, and this is where it really gets weird, you might not discuss huge chunks of stuff at all, right? Like, wow, we spent easily a week talking about this concept. It wasn't on the exam at all, and it's only because the hypos that were presented on the exam didn't require the use of that particular rule, that particular set of holdings associated with that issue. That issue was not on your exam, okay? Those things can be kind of challenging, and they can be kind of difficult to deal with early on. Because, you want to be able to demonstrate that you know what you're doing and you've done the work. And really, you're going to score points for making those tough choices as opposed to dumping everything in there. Okay? All right, so like I said, you end up with the holdings and the rules. You're just going to work on that hypothetical and put it together like that. Okay, let's talk about IRAC a little bit. Issue, rule, application, conclusion. Some people refer to that as analysis, conclusion. Same basic idea. That you're going to lead off by stating what the issue is, plugging in the corresponding rule. And as I mentioned, if you already have your outline, your issues, and your rules are in there. They're organized by issue. You should have that part ready to go, right? You cleared the first hurdle in that you were able to spot the issue. Go ahead and reward yourself by writing the issue down, sliding the rule in there. Then you can kind of lean back, crack your knuckles a little bit, and then start applying it to the set of facts. The only new stuff, really, should be the hypothetical facts you've been presented with, and you can spend the 30 minutes doing some of that interesting analogizing and distinguishing. Okay. As I also mentioned too, this is very much a deductive presentation. If I'm the reader, I don't want to sit and synthesize the rule with you. I don't want to sit and decide which holding is the best holding. That's why I paid you to come work for me. If I'm a judge, I don't want you to sort of give me all of your research, all of your cases, and all of your facts, and have me do the work. You have to do that work for me, because I'm lazy and I just want to read it from the top. It's like making sausage and serving sausage, right? So you plug in your rule, you find maybe a holding or 2 if they're there. Exams can be a little bit weird sometimes in that you may not always rely on specific cases. You might find yourself in a situation where you're simply dropping in the rule and applying it to a set of facts. It depends on the course, the amount of time you have to work on each case. But if there's a case there that provides you with an obvious analogy, provides you with an obvious comparison to your case, be sure to drop it in there, because you're going to score some points that way. Along the way, what you're demonstrating are skills. I have the skill of discerning which issue is relevant here. I've already done the synthesis outside of class, and I'm going to show you that I've done that. I can now also discern which of the 5 cases we read is actually relevant or similar enough to this factual situation that it can provide for a nice comparison. And now I'm going to show you how I can incorporate relevant facts into this and reach a conclusion. In a weird way, the conclusion itself may not be as important as the analysis, right? If you reach a conclusion that's contrary to what your professor was thinking, as long as it's consistent with your analysis, you're probably fine, right? And again, they try to create hypotheticals that are close enough in terms of outcome and decision that it's not cut and dry. It isn't just going to be a Roomba again. It isn't just going to be a self-driving car. They're testing the limits of the rule, and in doing that, they're also probably testing the likelihood that something's going to be a robot or not a robot. It doesn't matter which way you come down necessarily, as long as it's consistent with your reasoning and how you've decided to shape it. Okay. Issues, you can state them broadly, you can state them narrowly. One thing we haven't talked about too much here, and we'll kind of dig into this, I think, a little bit more over the next few weeks in legal writing, especially, is that one of the trickier things about issues is kind of what I alluded to a minute ago, is there's always main issues and sub-issues, right? Issues have a tendency to sort of mutate a little bit. The big issue is Is somebody negligent? That's a combination of 4 smaller issues, including duty, breach, causation, damages. In some instances, a sub-issue can get unruly and divide into some factors or divide into some other sub-issues as well. In most cases, you'll find yourself probably having to drop down outline fashion at least 2 levels, right? A lot of times, especially in today's world, you find yourself in a situation where the main structure of the rule, the main requirements of the rule might actually be in a statute, right? You might say, is this a burglary? The statute will say, well, it's a burglary if it satisfies these 8 elements, okay? Those are the 8 sub-issues. So big issue, is it burglary? Smaller issues, each one of these 8 sub-issues, these 8 elements of the statute is identified. And in some instances, some of those elements might subdivide further. That's usually where it stops, okay? That's usually where issues kind of settle down a little bit and stop being unruly. You're probably going to find yourself in like the big A, so the Roman numeral 1, big A, A1, A2, A3 type of category in order to resolve things. And what you want to be able to do is isolate concepts, isolate issues, and deal with them on their own terms and resolve them so that you can answer bigger questions. We'll get into that in almost too much detail in legal writing over the next few weeks. So don't worry about it too much right now. Think of these as just single issue problems that we're going to work on. The rule, we've kind of beat that to death at this point in time. Like I said, you can benefit a lot from just having it hanging out right there in your outline, right? You benefit in 2 ways. One is what I've already mentioned, you're not trying to synthesize a rule in 20 seconds in class. And 2, the rule is probably so refined that it's in the language that people are accustomed to, right? The language that will make your professor perk up and purr, that you actually, those phrases that pay. The language of the law, those terms of art that are customary in stating those iconic rules as well. So you're prepared in 2 ways. Not only do you have a rule ready to go and you're saving yourself some time, but it's also in the cool phraseology that they're accustomed to seeing with respect to that rule. Boom, boom, those 2 things go in. Then it's just a question of choosing which holdings you want to use and applying them to the facts. Let's talk for a second about analogies. Analogies are a little bit tricky too, in that it's easy to kind of view them in terms of comparison. You can compare pretty much anything you want, essentially, but the comparison only matters if the 2 cases share the same issue and the 2 cases help you resolve the facts. And so understanding how to craft analogies and even understanding how to take advantage of distinctions between the facts of your case, the hypothetical case, and the facts that you've been dealing with in class takes a bit of practice. You guys are actually doing a really good job of it yesterday. I could tell in terms of the things you were pulling out of the podcast episodes that when we do analogies and distinctions here in just a minute, you're going to be in good shape. But it unfolds like this. I like to have little markers in my head. Even if I don't use those markers ultimately in the text of my IRAC, it's helpful for me to think in terms of these little markers as a way of making sure I'm thinking properly about what I'm plugging in, and in some instances it almost helps me draft it. So, the issue here, I like to think about it in terms of a whether-when kind of thing on an exam, okay? Whether whatever the device might be is a robot, when forces you to kind of insert some of the facts from the hypothetical and make a complete issue statement. So, whether my cup of coffee is a robot when it sits there in a cup and has a lid on top of it or something like that, right? You get the complete issue statement in there. Having the kind of that whether-when set of markers in your head is a good way to go. And you might ask yourself, I don't want to do that on every single issue. It starts to sound a little bit rote and routine. But it's a way of thinking. It's a way of just kind of keeping your head in the right place. The rule, I always like to think about, in my mind, I take a breath and I say in general, right? Take a moment, close my eyes and think in general. In general, a robot is a mechanical device. What you're doing there is you're making sure you're actually drafting a rule. Okay? You don't want the rule to be so specific that it's only tied, you're not trying to define what a Roomba is or a self-driving car. We've left that. The quality of the rule that makes it a rule is that it has a life of its own. It's sort of abstracted itself from those cases and can apply to a bunch of different things. You've basically become a legislator and you've decided that you've codified what the rule is for a robot. So I like to think about it as in general. A robot is a mechanical device capable of independent movement and so forth. That's just our synthesized rule from yesterday. And if you decided not to leave the in general in there, no problem. And then when it gets into the application portion of it, First thing I like to think about is for example, right? So for example becomes a nice little way of thinking, okay, I dropped the rule in there. If I have a holding in my possession somewhere that I think is relevant to this outcome, I'm going to go ahead and insert that holding here. And what helps me remember to do that and helps me remember what a holding is versus a rule is just the little clause there, for example. And again, if you don't end up using it in the finished product, perfectly fine. For example, the podcast held, in your case it'd be the case held, right, the court held, that a blank was or was not a robot because, okay? All we're doing is we're dropping in holdings. If you look at this right here, right, at that point in time, all I'm asking you to do there is simply drop in the content of these holdings, essentially. And what it is the rule in action someplace else. The whole process has been turned on its head. The rule is taking the lead now, and the cases become examples of the rule in action as opposed to the source from which the rule was derived, right? So, for example, the podcast held that blank was or was not a robot because you got the procedural result in there. The because allows you to incorporate the relevant facts, the relevant rationale from the case. Okay, you're setting up the analogy in that instance. And then for comparison, you do this, right? In this case, you could say, either in this case or similarly, you could say in contrast. Kind of depends on what you're planning to do with that holding that you set up. Are you planning to use that as an analogy? Or are you planning to distinguish that holding from your situation? In this case, similarly, a blank is a robot because, and you're just drawing comparisons between, and you can compare the facts, you can compare compare or contrast, rather, the facts, compare or contrast the rationale, and even if the holding had a different procedural result, distinguishing a case is in a lot of ways almost as beneficial as analogizing one, okay? And then you conclude, boom, therefore, plunk, it's a robot because, okay? That's really all there is to it. We went, it's from the top down this time as opposed to the bottom up. And it really did just sort of take the process from yesterday, dump it on its head, and allow us to sort of present it to somebody in that fashion, okay? Any questions about that? I should have told you guys I had this one too. I'm going to pass on. Oh, see? If you could see the daggers I'm getting from over in this. No, I'm just joking. Let me pass this one out really quick. I'm going to pass this one out too because we need to have in our possession two things. Because I want you to be able to use both of these today to get this done. There's that. I probably didn't save enough of these. So if it wasn't already blazingly obvious what's going to happen next, right? What we're going to do is we are going to take this, and we're going to try to practice a couple of IRACs, 2, 3 of them today in the time that we have remaining, essentially. And what I want you to do, I'm going to give you a new scenario, okay? A new thing. The first one would be these Mars rovers, and I tried from Wikipedia to clip facts that I think might be relevant in terms of what a Mars rover is. Right? And what I want you to do is, if you kind of are willing to volunteer and help me through this process, is IRAC this for me. But I want you to do it in a very formal way. That's why I gave you this. Okay? I want you to sort of use the language that's in here. I want you to say, the issue is whether a Mars rover is a robot when. Plug in the facts that you want to use. Okay? And then drop our rule in there. And then say, for example, the podcast held. And when you do that, I want you to choose from among these 4 holdings in here what you think might be a useful case for comparison. So as you look at it and you say, what is a Mars rover most similar to, or is there a distinction in there I think I can take advantage of, okay? Choose one, maybe. If you're feeling particularly excited, you could choose 2. And use it for comparison, and then bring in the facts from your case. Similarly, in this case, a Mars rover is this, or in contrast to a Roomba, a Mars rover is this, right? And you can draw that comparison and reach a conclusion as to whether you think it's a robot or not, okay? Take a couple of seconds, minutes, and look through this first one, okay? Thinking about that process, thinking about the facts from the hypothetical here, basically try to include a description of what they are, right? They trek up to 100 meters, about 24 hours. So it's sort of what the Martian day looks like, essentially. It's about 24 hours and 40 minutes long. They move safely from rock to rock. Read through those facts. think about what that's most comparable to in terms of the holdings, one or two of the holdings. And then ask yourself, are there any comparisons in there that lead you to believe that this is likely a robot as well? Or are there some distinctions that would lead you to believe the opposite? Okay, take a couple of minutes, kind of work through it, and then I'll ask for some volunteers to help me out. Yes? Yes, if you have a lot of natural knowledge about what Mars rovers are. Yeah, just let me so for a couple of reasons, just so that you can get kind of a quick overview. And yes, I chose some of these facts for reasons. Just kind of limit yourself to these facts up here. And we'll talk about Mars rovers later. Clearly you know everything about them. And one thing we might do too is if somebody presents their argument, I might have somebody counter that too if they're feeling strongly about the fact that this isn't a robot. Or at the very least, we can kind of discuss whether the distinctions are worthwhile. About time you guys got in a fight, because it's what, Thursday now? Okay. Who's feeling particularly brave and they want to take a shot at this? They feel pretty strongly about Mars rovers. Want to make sure that they're getting their due. Ah, yes. Okay. Yeah. Raise your hand, and my assistant will come over and provide you with a microphone. Give you a chance to test it out. Hear your voice in the. Okay. And then, yeah. Go ahead and. Oh, is it on?
Yep.
Is it? Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and so, like I said, I'm going to hold you to this, even as dumb as it sounds, because I want you to start. It's not so much a matter of just picking the magic words, but I want you to start thinking in terms of kind of disciplining yourself to kind of walk through an IRAC. A lot of times, I'll see people kind of crush an IRAC into one paragraph. Slow it down a little bit, open it up. Let me know what the issue is, what the rule is, the whole 9 yards.
All right. So the issue here is a Mars rover a robot when it receives instructions once daily from scientists and relies upon those instructions to move safely between location and location.
Okay, and you notice in choosing those facts, he's probably chose those for a reason, right? And sometimes you might actually plug the facts in on your issue afterward, right? And after the analysis is complete, maybe you go back and you pick the facts you think were most relevant and plug it in. And again, what he's doing is creating a holding in advance. But go ahead.
And then the rule is our synthesized rule. In general, a robot is a mechanical device capable of independent movement and possessing an intelligence or consciousness that is integrated with and aware of its physical properties. The analysis, for example, the podcast held that a self-driving car is not a robot because it lacks necessary degree of autonomy in that humans are needed to input intelligence regarding routes. The podcast also held that a Roomba was a baseline robot because it had enough autonomy that it did not rely on constant input from humans. In conclusion,
now, hang on. So you set up the self-driving car there, and you contrast it against the Roomba, which is good, okay? And now bring in the facts from the Mars rover to let me know, is it more like a Roomba or more like a self-driving car?
I did that in the C. Should I do that
in the conclusion?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's part of the actual analysis and the conclusion. Therefore I'm right. So yeah.
Well, I can just do that then. So the Mars rover requires daily input of instructions, and it relies upon those instructions to move from location to location. It lacks the autonomy, as in the Google self-driving car, and is distinguished from the Roomba. Therefore, it is not a robot.
Okay, and then that's the conclusion you've reached. How many of you agree with him that it's not a robot? Now, in doing that analysis, right, and it's an excellent job. You picked out two great cases, two nice comparisons there. In order to push it a little bit further and conclude it, right, is there anything in there that's lingering for you, right? It seems, you mentioned that it's more like a self-driving car and less like a Roomba, essentially. But is it completely like a self-driving car? Are there some distinctions here that you can incorporate? And again, part of this analysis process is you're recognizing that these are the similarities, right? And I like to think of these as sort of your although arguments, right? Although, a Mars rover isn't or doesn't, you can incorporate that in there so that your professor is thinking to him or herself that, okay, you're doing some deep analysis here. You're getting the full picture in there. You're still reaching one conclusion, but you're saying that, yeah, it's similar in these ways, although it's not, completely similar. These are these differences, but those differences don't matter in the grand scheme of things. You got to push that analysis a little bit forward. So, in what ways is this potentially different from either a self-driving car or a Roomba?
So I thought about those. I just didn't want to write it all. It's different from a self-driving car.
Explain that to your professor later. I thought about those, but I didn't include them. It's different from a self-driving car in what way?
Cramp. The self-driving car is receiving constant, continual input, and the Mars rover is only receiving input once a day.
Okay.
But I think that's mostly because of a technical limitation with the Mars rover, given the fact that it's difficult. That creates difficulty for the scientists and the Mars rover.
Okay.
I would draw an inference that if they had an opportunity to send it continual data, they would.
Okay.
So it's not a distinction that I think is relevant to whether it is or is not a robot.
Let's come back to your concept there, because you led off in your description of the cases, both the self-driving car and the Roomba. You led off with the idea of autonomy, right? We're talking about autonomy in a weird way. If you think about this whole process goes from general concepts to specifics, and so the issue is whether this is a robot, right? But the real issue kind of lurking inside the issue, even though you're not going to subdivide it in here, but the real issue kind of lurking inside of this example is it autonomous enough, right? Is it autonomous enough that it would satisfy the test as a robot? And the Roomba satisfies the test, the self-driving car does not, okay? So when it comes back to autonomy, you're saying that even though it's receiving input on a different schedule, less often than the self-driving car is, that's not enough to carry the day, right? That's not enough to push it over from being not autonomous, whatever that might be, independent or dependent, I guess, on human input in some way, such that you would think it was a robot, not a robot, basically, a robot.
Right.
Okay. Anybody disagree with that? Anybody want to challenge that a little bit? Right here. We'll get you a microphone. You can tell me, in the meantime, we'll talk about, where you're from and what brings you to town today.
So do you want me to go through the whole IRAC, or do you want me to
Did you come down with a different conclusion altogether?
Yeah.
Okay, in that case, yes. Let's go through the whole IRAC.
Okay.
I'm going to go the opposite direction.
Whether a Mars rover is a robot when it crosses Mars without lots of human interaction and has the intelligence to position itself and take pictures, analyze minerals and elements to perform its function. The rule is the autonomous mechanical device is capable of independent movement and possessing intelligence or consciousness that is integrated with and aware of its physical properties. For example, the podcast held that a Roomba with a baseline robot with autonomy, because the device does not require continued input of a human operator, is similar to the rover because the rover can only receive information once a day to perform its function, which is similar to the Roomba in the sense of it having the computer chip that can function, providing its direction, but the Roomba does provide operates without the human interaction to fulfill its process. And it differs from the self-driving car because it does not require human interaction to move across Mars to go to its direct location.
Okay, so you've kind of carved out a little bit of a distinction there where you're saying, yes, it does maybe receive more input from humans than a Roomba does, but there are other ways in which it's similar to a Roomba that leads you to believe it's actually more like it. So it's getting its routes more infrequently than you would of a self-driving car. But while it's hanging out waiting for instructions on where to go, is it doing more on its own than a self-driving car might do? Is it doing more on its own because it's kind of trapped up there and lonely, and it's, like I'm about to bump into something and it's going to take 20 minutes for planet Earth to tell me to, hang a left. I'm going to go ahead and do that on my own. Does that degree of autonomy, so it's not route specific necessarily, it's still being told where to go, but it's kind of out there on a limb a little bit in that, navigating whatever obstacles might be there between, here and where the humans have told me to go 24 hours ago. Is that enough of a distinction that I can take it out of the comparison to a self-driving car, say that that's a different type of autonomy, I guess, and such that it might be a robot? Yeah.
I was just wondering, because it says, it talks about how it takes the 20 minutes for instructions, but I thought that meant that the rover potentially runs into rocks and things like that all the time.
Yeah.
So is that what that's saying, or can it maneuver?
I think it has to sort of navigate somewhat to its on its own. I think that there is, unlike remote controls, constant instantly see what is happening to a rover at any given moment, and they cannot send quick commands. There was something about it. The rover is expected to move over a given distance, precisely position itself. I think there was some indication in there that, tells the rover which targets to go, that it could do a little bit of its own navigation on its own, essentially, from running into a rock. So it cannot send quick commands to keep it from running into a rock or falling off a cliff, essentially. So if it's able to do a little bit of that navigation on its own, then that's definitely, the type of thing that might distinguish it in some way. Yes, now you're gonna be challenged on the microphone in front. Oh.
I don't think it really does distinguish it from that, because in the self-driving car, it's the same thing. You've told it where to go, and then you're relying on the car to slow down when there's an object in front of it or avoid it. So I don't think there is any distinction.
So you would sort of describe those as those kind of like driving assists that they were talking about, the assistant driver kind of stuff that they were talking about in the podcast. Yeah, that might be a way to, again, distinguish from the distinguish, okay? And this is kind of cool because what you guys are doing really is you're sort of litigating, right? You have one client who wants this to be a robot and another client who doesn't want this to be a robot. And you're just, as an attorney, you're not really maybe married to any position. You're just there to kind of make a point on behalf of your client and convince the court that you're correct. And the distinction's just room to kind of have a little bit of fun with how they bounce back and forth, okay? Yeah. Let's go back there, since you're close to the...
So I think that what's important is to distinguish what the autonomy is, where with, at least with the Roomba, it has the computer intelligence that all you do, you turn it on, and then it completes its task by determining exactly what it should do. Where with the self-driving cars and the Mars rover, they're specifically told what to do in each case. So I think the autonomy is literally just the robot doing what it thinks it should do instead of what it's been told to do.
And you guys you're sort of redefining autonomy every time, which is cool, right? And a good way to do this is, and that's how analogies work. I don't want to just say one thing's orange and another thing's orange, right? What's really important is how their shared orangeness exists inside of a broader concept. That the facts become secondary to what you're trying to accomplish with the smaller concept here. What is autonomy, right? You can almost define, let's not do that, but define a rule for autonomy if you wanted to. Like lurking inside of the concepts that we put together for this rule are a few things. What does it mean to be autonomous? What does it mean to be independent? What does it mean to be integrated? You could, parse those rules, those ideas out and tear them apart as well. Yes? I wouldn't go that far. And I see at some point in time, just for your own sanity, basically, and we'll get into this more in methods, it's kind of a judgment call, really. It depends on if the courts are treating autonomy and integration and those types of things as factors or elements in the test, then yes, I would isolate each one of those and deal with them individually. But at some point, if it's got to stop, right? At some point in time, it's just a single issue. Is this a robot? And even though there might be concepts in there, facets in there, if it gets too subdivided, it's just like a granular mess at some point. It needs context in order to get it done. But you guys are doing exactly what you do, is you're rooting it in the concept, okay? Let's try one more, because I think it's kind of cool. And then we'll call it good. You guys seen the movie Big Hero 6? I'm about to spoil it for you if you haven't seen the movie Big Hero 6. Read this one really quick, and we'll kind of go through the same process. This BAM, and it's interesting because they call it an inflatable robot. Don't be drawn off by that, okay? But yeah, read through the facts of this one, and then we'll spend a couple of minutes doing the same thing. If you think that this qualifies as a robot or not. Yeah, there's the end of the movie, I'm sorry. Still worth watching, though. It'll still make you cry, don't it? To float for eternity in another dimension. That's how I want to go. Yes. In toto, let's put it that way. So this might present you with all those, right? He may have certain characteristics of a robot, but if that part at the end changes your mind in some way, then it's a complete analysis in that way. Yes. I think that Baymax kind of encourages him to do that, and then I think like it says, Hero reluctantly does that. Has anybody seen the movie recently and can back me up on that? Yes. So he does sacrifice himself basically, and gives him the kind of the arm part of it, so that he floats for eternity, like it says, in another dimension. It's quite a sacrifice. But I like the question because it's obvious to me what you're thinking. See? By the way, the guys in the podcast said that Mars rover is not a robot. Too far. It's like a big old remote control car that's several hundred light years away. I don't know, million light years away. How far away is it? Okay, we got about 5 minutes left here, so I don't want to cut you short, but I want to give you a chance to either defend Baymax's robothoodness or not. Who wants to take a stab at this one? Ooh. Aha, right here in the middle, right? And again, just for the sake of making me happy, kind of walk through the talking points.
Okay, so the issue seems to be whether or not Baymax is a robot when his essence can be transferred.
Okay.
So from one body to another.
And again, notice the facts you grabbed, right? You grabbed the facts that are relevant to the whole thing, right?
Right. And so, do you want me to reread the rule?
No, go ahead. We all know what the rule is by now.
We could recite it.
That's all right. Not a reading exercise necessarily.
So the application is the podcast ruled that Johnny Five was not a robot because his essence could not be replicated or transferred.
Okay.
And then I think that you could make the argument that it's not like his essence was transferred because maybe the chip was the robot itself. However, to be a robot, I think the flatworm case demonstrates that you can't just have the programming separate from the device. The device and the programming have to be unified to make it a complete robot.
Okay.
So in that case, Baymax is not a robot.
Okay. And so not a robot because toward the end there, they basically just rebuild him based on the...
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in doing that, that's excellent. I think you picked out the two best cases for comparison here. And just like we kind of hooked into autonomy as part of the discussion in the previous one, and it kind of gave us some context to come back to. In leading off your discussion of the cases, I try to find that same hook, right? And you reach it there toward the end where you say they were unified. What are the language they use to kind of talk about how a robot is sort of in tune with itself? It has its selfness. Yes, right here. Yeah, it's what?
Integrated and aware of its physical
Integrated
properties.
and aware of its properties, right? So you can kind of, again, you're looking for maybe a concept you can use as the linchpin to complete this analogy. So like or unlike Johnny Five, who was integrated and aware of his properties, and then you could kind of go to that, his consciousness could not be passed around, could not be just downloaded and dropped into another device. Baymax, under these circumstances, it looks as though his consciousness can be offloaded and just sort of reinvented in another. Therefore, maybe he isn't integrated and aware of his own properties. Baymax. Who wants to defend Baymax and say that yes, he is? Yes, right here.
I had a quick question. So it doesn't say here if Johnny Five was or was not a robot.
Actually, they said that Johnny Five was a robot. That's my fault for not giving you
because his consciousness could not be transferred.
Yeah, there was a bunch and what's interesting too is that in doing this part of it, there's a few things, and this is what we're alluding to at the outset. There's a few things about Baymax that are given, right? He can navigate his own environment, and you can use those in there as an although, right? Although Baymax can navigate his environment, he seems autonomous. There's some question as to whether he's integrated, and so it's a nice way to set it up. You're identifying the facts that seem to lean in favor of him being one, but then there's a distinction in there that causes you to go the opposite direction. So Johnny Five's the same way in that he's independent, he can navigate his environment. So they share that thing, but is that distinction enough to have you shift the other way?
And I guess according to the rule that we have down as is, you can't say that Baymax, I mean, maybe with knowing what we know about the podcasts, but I don't think as is we can say that Baymax is not a robot because it says that he has to have integrated and aware of his physical properties, but it doesn't say that can never be separated.
Okay.
And so at the moment that it's separated, maybe that changes things, but not according to the rule as we have it stated.
Okay, and specifically in the Johnny Five case, they said they had a consciousness, right? They had a consciousness that couldn't be downloaded and shifted and moved over to another entity, essentially, okay? Any other distinct? Yes?
Well, I'm thinking that perhaps...
Here's your mic right here, Tony.
Perhaps Baymax is aware of its physical properties, but not integrated.
Okay.
The fact that he can move from chip to, move the chip from body to body, that's the integrated piece. But the fact that he control his rocket arm or whatever That's the aware piece.
Okay, and when it comes to awareness, see, this was the question you were asking me, right? I'm going to put you on the spot and have you kind of follow up on what you were, thinking earlier. You asked me an interesting question, and how does that lend itself to maybe arguing in favor of Baymax being aware of his physical properties, or aware of consciousness, I guess we call it?
Well, is this even on? If Baymax can make the decision to save somebody's life, he's clearly autonomous.
Okay. And make the decision to save somebody's life, and do what in the process of saving? How did he save this kid's life?
He has intelligence, he's learning.
Okay. Okay. And what else did he do in terms of, yes? He sacrificed himself, right? He sacrificed, what did he sacrifice? He sacrificed himself to save the kid, right? And if you sacrifice yourself, I think you can make the argument that you're aware that you're giving something up. Well, he's giving something up that's going to float around in a dimension for eternity. Yes? He was programmed to always put the hero first. Yeah. So it's just part of his programming and not his consciousness or his awareness. Yes, a couple more, and then we gotta go. We'll go right here in the middle to my favorite robot friend and center.
Well, I think based on these facts, it works out that he does make that decision.
Yeah.
But I think in the movie, he says that Hero has to actually make that choice.
Okay.
So he does rely on that human command, which would make him not a robot.
Okay.
But based on these facts, I think, yes, he is.
So Hero actually makes the choice for him, right? Baymax can't make the ultimate choice.
Yeah.
Hero can.
Yeah.
And that the whole case might turn on just that idea, right? If he's making the choice, oh, no, I'll save you, then he is conscious and aware of himself. Otherwise, he's just a big balloon. Yes, Becky.
Biggest issue I'm having is that, like with a Roomba, for example, like you can still take out the programming chip and move it to a different Roomba body, and it would still a robot. It's still considered a robot.
Okay.
So I would make the argument that he's both a robot and not a robot. It just depends on whether he is or is not integrated into a body.
Is anybody familiar enough with the movie to remember what that second Baymax looked? Was it just exactly the same as Baymax, or was it like, did he? Like he saved his memories essentially. Yeah. It's because it's in the hand, right? It's in like his feet. He's like chips in his hand or something like that. In the podcast, that's sort of what it turned on in the podcast. The idea too that that if he's conscious of the fact that he's sacrificing himself, then yes, it would seem like he's aware of his consciousness or his body, and that he's giving himself up. The other thing that they were concerned about too is that maybe what was left over, what was in the new Baymax, wasn't really the old Baymax, right? It was just components of it, like memories or maybe some of the programming. It wasn't necessarily his essence, essentially. And they relied on that to determine that he was a robot in the podcast. But doesn't mean that they're always right. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, I think that goes along with the flatworm.
Yeah.
Example that, like, it was denied as to what
Yep.
but we have no way of knowing.
Right. I think that's the way they actually described it. Is that maybe this is Baymax 2.0 or Roomba 11.7 probably, or something like that. Okay, one more question, then we gotta go. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and it might be one of those situations where whatever the resolution by the court, and you have to kind of go with what the court says, right? The resolution by the court in this case might be the kind of thing that helps clarify the rule or change that portion of the rule a little bit. That part that's hanging out there in the end that talks about being integrated and about being conscious. This might lend more information to understand that part of it, which is this whole process. I mean, the rules are always kind of waiting there to be altered in some fashion depending on the facts. So, all right, thanks guys, that was fun. Go ahead and go to lunch, and I'll see some of you later today.